In September of 1972, a series of bizarre encounters occurred at an industrial complex in the Argentinian city of Cordoba. Over the course of 1 week, witnesses to the phenomenon described crossing paths with a mysterious intruder, one whose origins remain unknown to this day. Whether it was man, beast, or something else entirely, we still have little explanation for the Santa Isabel entity. Opened in 1955, the Santa Isabel manufacturing plant is owned and maintained by the Renault Motor Company, a French multinational that produces a wide range of vehicles and aircraft. The site itself is situated just outside the limits of Cordoba, the largest city in central Argentina. Throughout the late 1950s and 60s, the Santa Isabel plant grew quickly. By the 1970s, it was already a sprawling industrial complex covering over 200 hectares. With its numerous factories and service buildings all connected by a network of internal roads, it was almost like a city in itself. Nevertheless, the plant's existence remained relatively unknown outside of South America. The only time it was even mentioned was when global economic or supply chain issues affected its output. That was until the closing months of 1972. That year, a bizarre tale was published in several national newspapers. The story detailed accounts from several workers at the plant, all of whom claimed they'd had mysterious run-ins with an otherworldly visitor. The first of these incidents reportedly took place during the early hours of the 21st of September. That evening, a night worker named Teodoro Merlo was making his usual rounds alone, as he often did. Merlo's responsibilities included securing all staff and locker rooms. As he checked each area, he kept an eye out for anything unusual and ensured the rooms were ready for use the following day. At around 1:40 a.m., Merlo entered the plant's forging section. After verifying that the doors to the main changing room were securely locked, he continued his patrol. About 4 hours later, he returned to the same changing room doors. Finding them still locked and wanting to answer a call of nature, he used his key to enter. The interior consisted of a large rectangular room with toilets along the rear wall, shower cubicles in the center, and 2 long trough wash basins in the far corners opposite the toilets. The walls were lined with storage lockers for the workers' personal belongings. Upon entering, Merlo switched the light on above the nearest basins. This left the other side of the room dark, but there was still enough ambient light to make out details within those shadowy recesses. It was as he was strolling towards one of the toilet cubicles that he glanced to his left and came to a sudden and unexpected halt. In the darkness there, he could see the outline of a tall and muscular figure, sitting on the wash basins opposite. Merlo would later estimate that it stood nearly 8 feet tall, far larger than the average man. Dressed in a tight-fitting dark blue outfit, the figure seemed almost to merge with the shadows around it. It was sitting in an odd pose, with its arm bent in such a way that its elbow was sticking out to one side, with its finger pointing towards its mouth. Initially, Merlo assumed it was simply another worker, despite its unusual size, but as his eyes focused, he began to have his doubts. The figure's face had an unnatural quality, sharp angular features with large pointed ears and a triangular nose. Its skin was alarmingly pale, almost like fresh plaster, and it had no hair. But by far the most disturbing aspect was its eyes. Thin, slanted, and devoid of any glimmer of life, Merlo would later describe them as utterly soulless. As he studied the figure, a growing sense of dread took hold. Against his better judgment, he began to approach, but then froze as he heard an odd tapping noise, like metal against glass. At the same moment, the light behind him flicked off, causing him to look in that direction. However, the light at the other end of the room, above the figure, blinked into life. In the fraction of a second that Merlo had looked away, the figure vanished, as if it had dissolved into thin air. Startled, he turned, half expecting to see it escaping through the other door. But the room was empty. Almost immediately, the dread that had gripped him turned into a strange warmth. His eyes filled with tears, and he was struck by a sudden and intense migraine. Stumbling out into the hallway, he found it empty. As his symptoms slowly subsided, he tried to rationalize what he'd just seen. It was late. He'd been awake all night. Surely it was just his mind playing tricks. Still feeling uneasy, he hurriedly completed his duties before leaving the plant to go home. Unfortunately, this eerie encounter was only the beginning of a series of unsettling events. The next day, Merlot awoke feeling much better. Knowing he was due back at work that evening, he had a meal and left his house at around 9:30 p.m. Like most overnight workers, he relied on the shift bus to get him to and from the plant, a routine that was rarely eventful. Yet, as he took his usual seat behind the bus driver, he felt that same strange sense of unease creeping over him. They hadn't been underway for long when Merlot glanced up at the rearview mirror above the driver. Instead of his own reflection alongside the other passengers, he saw the face of the intruder from the previous night. Somehow it filled the narrow strip of glass entirely, and it was staring directly at him. A wave of fear surged through Merlot's body. This time he could see the face in much sharper detail. Thin, narrow eyes regarded him from atop a pair of deep indentations set into the cheeks below. Beneath them was a triangular nose that seemed almost sculpted. Frantically, he looked around, searching for any sign of the figure elsewhere on the bus, but there was nothing, and none of the other passengers appeared to notice. Most were either asleep or chatting quietly, oblivious to the horror unfolding before him. Desperately hoping he was imagining things, Merlot looked back at the mirror only to find the face still watching him. It remained there, unblinking for several minutes, before slowly fading away. Deeply unsettled by this second encounter, he reported the incident to his superiors upon arriving at the plant that evening. He even provided a rough sketch of the figure to support his account. His managers listened without comment, merely advising him to keep the experience to himself to avoid any ridicule. Although Merlot never saw the mysterious figure again, he experienced 2 more strange incidents in the weeks that followed. On one occasion, the lights in a room where he was working began to strobe inexplicably, and during another shift, he lost nearly an hour of time with no recollection of what had happened. Neither of these subsequent experiences would rival the shock of those first 2 encounters, until he learned that he wasn't the only worker to have seen this mysterious interloper. A week after Teodoro Merlot shared his sketch of the mysterious intruder with his superiors, one of the plant's administrators, Enrique Moreno, approached management with an unsettling experience of his own. Like Merlot, Moreno worked the night shift, delivering documents between various offices across the vast facility on a motorbike, towing a trailer which carried his paperwork. On the evening of the 27th of September at around 10:30 p.m., Moreno was in an office in the engineering department collecting documents for distribution. As he was gathering the papers, the office lights suddenly flickered off and then back on. This disturbance was accompanied by a loud whirring noise similar to that of an industrial turbine. He later noted that no machinery was operating nearby at the time. Shrugging this off, Moreno left the office and continued his rounds. After his final delivery, he headed back towards the main gate to clock out. His route took him past a row of vehicle chassis stacked by the roadside, awaiting relocation. As he approached, he noticed a very tall, shadowy figure walking behind the stacked metal frames. At first, he assumed that it was someone being carried on the shoulders of a fellow worker, or perhaps even a man on stilts. As he drew closer, the figure turned to look directly at him, and then his bike's engine began to sputter. Suddenly, the wheels locked, bringing him to a halt directly in front of this mysterious stranger, who was standing just a few meters away. Moreno later described the figure's movement as unnatural. Its head and arms did not seem to move independently, but appeared fixed in place with the rest of its body. Now able to observe it more closely, Moreno noticed its eerie pale skin, pronounced ears, and the soft green glow emanating from its dark one-piece suit. He also saw a silver belt around its waist, sporting a thick holster of the same material. Frozen with a mix of fear and confusion, Moreno sat on his idling bike, unable to look away. Then, a sharp, acrid smell filled the air around him, as if something nearby was burning. A throbbing pressure built in his head and ears, and as he tried to raise his hand to his forehead, he found that he could barely move his limbs. Paralyzed, Moreno had no idea what to expect next. After a moment, the figure simply turned and walked off into the darkness. The instant it vanished from sight, his bike wheels suddenly unlocked, propelling him towards the security office. Barely able to regain control of his bike, Moreno arrived at the main gate, where a guard immediately berated him for his reckless driving. But upon seeing Moreno's expression, the guard quickly realized that something was wrong. After listening to Moreno's story, he agreed to accompany the admin worker back onto site in the hopes of locating the strange figure. They found no trace of it apart from 2 small rectangular indentations pressed into the ground, and curiously, the fact that the nearby metal chassis were warm to the touch. There was also something strange about Moreno's watch. The journey from the engineering office to the gate should have taken only a minute, and the encounter itself, by Moreno's estimate, lasted around 30 seconds. He recalled checking the time before leaving the office and saw that it was 11:13 p.m. Yet when he arrived at the gate, the guard logged his approach at 11:30 p.m., a discrepancy of more than quarter of an hour. Strangely, Moreno's watch had stopped at 11:13 p.m. and was later found to be highly magnetized. The lethargy he felt from the encounter lingered well into the next day. When he finally awoke, his girlfriend mentioned that he'd been talking in his sleep, mumbling about a metal man. Despite his unsettling experience, he managed to brush it off and return to work that evening. Initially, the shift was uneventful, but later, whilst alone in his office, Moreno heard the same turbine-like whirring from the night before, this time accompanied by bright flashing lights from outside the window. Peering out, he was shocked to see the same tall figure he'd encountered by the vehicle chassis, watching him from a patch of waste ground a few meters away. It stared at him for a few seconds before walking away with an unusual gait. Racing to the main entrance, Moreno found the same guard from the previous evening and urgently requested his help in locating the mysterious figure once and for all. Together they searched the waste ground and surrounding areas, but found no sign of the entity. Though the guard sympathized with his story, he suggested that Moreno head home to get some rest. Just 4 hours after Enrique Moreno's second sighting, a delivery driver named Lovehold Rodriguez was brought into the security office looking visibly shaken. The 2 employees who escorted him reported that they had found him sitting in his lorry in the middle of the complex, seemingly dazed and confused. After taking a few moments to gather his thoughts, Rodriguez was able to explain what had happened. He'd just finished delivering a load of sheet metal and was preparing to leave the site when suddenly, his cab filled with a bright, unexpected light. Startled, he looked around, searching for the source, and saw a large shadow pass by the driver's side window. Though he recognized its shape to be humanoid, it was so tall that Rodriguez could not see its head. Moments later, the truck's engine stalled, and the surrounding streetlights went out. Simultaneously, he felt a sharp buzzing in his head. Like Moreno, he tried to lift his hands to ease the discomfort, only to discover that he couldn't move his limbs. As his fear grew, he heard a deep rumbling sound, and his truck began to vibrate violently, causing objects on the dashboard to fall to the floor. Through the windscreen, he could see that the only light on the dark roadway was coming from a round object held by the towering figure, now moving in front of his vehicle. Rodriguez's description of the being matched Moreno's exactly. Large bat-like ears, a muscular build, and pale, hairless skin. Even its stiff, unnatural gait was the same. Rodriguez noted that the figure's legs barely seemed to bend at the knees, giving it a strange rocking motion as it walked. Meanwhile, its head and arms remained rigid. As it moved away from the lorry, the only things visible were the paleness of its skin and the gleam of a silver belt at its waist. Then, it simply disappeared into the night. Even after the street lamps and his lorry lights suddenly flickered back to life, Rodriguez remained frozen, struggling to process what he had just witnessed. It was at that moment that two workers approached his vehicle. Seeing his distress, they offered to help him search the area for any trace of the figure. When their search turned up nothing, they took him to the security office where he recounted the incident to the guards. After filing a report, they escorted the still bewildered driver off the site. Whilst there are several theories regarding what the three workers saw at the Santa Isabel site during that fateful week in September 1972, one fact remains clear. None of the men knew each other prior to making their reports. Each of their accounts has remained consistent over the years with no evidence of dishonesty or exaggeration. No journalist or investigator has found fault with their statements, a rarity for reports of this kind. Whilst there were minor differences in how Merlo described the entity compared to Moreno and Rodriguez, these variations could easily be attributed to the intensity of the moment. Otherwise, their descriptions align almost perfectly. The most fringe of the theories suggest that the site may have drawn the attention of an alien emissary. Proponents of this view highlight the figure's mechanical movements and appearance, comparing it to other encounters which feature robotic extraterrestrial beings, such as those reported in the Pascagoula and Risley encounters. In both cases, witnesses described mechanical figures that behaved as if they were sentinels under alien control. Others suggest a more down-to-earth explanation, arguing that whilst the men may have been sincere in their accounts, they might have been victims of an elaborate prank. A manufacturing facility is filled with materials that could be used to construct a convincing costume. Skeptics point out that neither the guards nor the plant managers seemed alarmed by the reports, perhaps indicating that they knew more than they let on. The manager's advice to keep quiet could imply they were aware of the prank and simply wanted to avoid media interest. Though this theory is plausible and would track with similar allegations of pranksters dressing in fire suits at other industrial locations, one issue remains. How can we explain the physical and temporal effects each witness experienced? Teodoro Merlo reported an intense migraine, a feeling of heat and watery eyes, followed by nearly an hour of lost time. Enrique Moreno's motorbike malfunctioned, leaving him immobilized. He too reported lost time, along with pressure in his ears and an acrid smell. Love told Rodriguez experienced a buzzing in his head, and like Moreno, found himself unable to move when the figure was near. The similarities amongst their symptoms, particularly the sensation of heat and restricted movement, suggest exposure to forces well beyond a mere prank. According to records, the towering intruder seen at the Santa Isabel warehouses in 1972 was never encountered again, or if it was, any witnesses were encouraged to keep silent. Whether an elaborate hoax or an otherworldly visitation, the Santa Isabel entity's appearances remain memorable for their eerie consistency and the unsettling physical effects that have defied explanation. Were these men deceived by an elaborate prank, or did they glimpse something beyond human understanding? The question endures, much like the towering spectre of the shadowy figure itself.